Stops in pits weren't always lightning fast, and until recently any attempts faster than 2.3 seconds was a delight. Today such times are part of a routine that decides the fate of races. Many fans consider instant pit stops a legacy of technological progress and modern innovations, but in general mechanics fit into 5 seconds already in the early 90s. And this despite the fact that really fast pit stops in boxes appeared in Formula 1 only in 1982. Before that, most teams ignored this option and just drove from start to finish. Of course, mechanics used to be not as fast in training. It took 2 to 3 minutes to completely change wheels even with impact drivers. One smart man and group of fellow enthusiasts changed everything. And they were helped by 2 beer barrels and a small budget and a good old math. Let's follow the interesting evolution of pit stop in Formula 1. Motorsport appeared almost as soon as there were cars. It all started in France in the late 90s, when races competed on dusty, unpaved roads. Now we will call such races rallies. But the first Grand Prix took place a few years later near Le Mans, on a 65-mile track. The 2 crew members of the car were responsible for everything – driving, navigation and repairs. They had scheduled refueling stops. All the other times they stopped were due to either mechanical damage or a flat tire. The latter was a fairly frequent occurrence due to the road surface, and even then the importance of pit stops was felt. Renault used Michelin tires and won the races because Michelin invented the removable wheel rim, which allows you to remove the wheel rim and tire with it, instead of using a spade to pry the tire off the rim, as now done with bicycle tires. This invention saved a huge amount of time on the pit stop. In 1920 and 1930s, the racing format changed, and racing cars became more reliable, which meant that the second person in the car was no longer needed. And all the cars began to be designed with a high expectation of speed, so, in any case, there would be no room for another passenger in them. By this time, the races were already held on a large number of closed tracks. This meant that cars can be serviced at a certain point on the track. In most cases, pit stops were made on the starting line. Undoubtedly, the surfaces of the track became better, but tire punctures continued to occur. That is why it was necessary to change tires sometimes. At that time, the wheels on the car were held by one wing nut. The best and fastest way to screw it in and out was to use a large hammer. The races were long and the riders weren't examples of the healthy lifestyle they are today. Pit stops were often accompanied by chilled champagne and a cigarette. However, some riders still wanted to stay in shape. In the late 1930s, large car companies were already consciously participating in racing, and cars began to be created specifically for racing. However, pit stops were still only a dream. The term health and safety hasn't been invented yet. Teams simply poured buckets of fuel from open containers, spilling everything onto the car. Drivers didn't use seat belts. In fact, they didn't even consider it necessary to get out of the car when refueling. Riders simply put a towel over their shoulders to minimize fuel splashes falling on them. Tires at the time had to withstand the entire distance of the race, and while the road surface got better, they were still not perfect. Therefore, the tires sometimes wore out before the race ended. At present, it seemed like absolute madness that there was no separation between the track and the team's pits. But at that time, pouring buckets of fuel seemed like a great idea. No separation from the main roadway, just a small pocket marked with paint. It was in these pockets that the mechanics serviced the cars while Fangio, Ascari and Farina drove by them at speed of 200+ km per hour. A pit stop in those days took a minute or 2, and each car was served by 2 people. They didn't have impact drivers, the balls were clocked with hammers. The mechanics stood behind the wall in the pit lane and jumped over it when the car drew up. No helmets, no special suits, no safe equipment for refueling, and when returning to the race, the crews also pushed the car so it quickly picked up speed. Yeah, no less brave people work in the pits than in cockpits. At the same time, the race lasted for 3 hours. Cars sometimes came to pit stops for fuel and new tires several times. although everything depending on the model, weather and the chosen strategy. By this point, the cars built for the Grand Prix were the ultimate vehicle for racing. Motors could be used to the maximum. Engineers fought the fuel problem by simply making fuel tank bigger and bigger. Of course, this made the cars incredibly heavy at the start, which led to difficulties in driving. But in the late 50s, the English company Cooper completely expanded the sport. So much so that everyone decided pit stops would be a thing of the past. Engineers come up with the mid-engine layout and remove the engine and gearbox from the nose of the car. As a result, F1 cars became lighter, more efficient, faster and more balanced. They no longer got dozens of gallons of fuel and wore out tires in a dozen laps. Along with the reduction in the distance of the Grand Prix, pit stops were carried out less and less, only in emergency cases. In a standard situation, the riders rolled from the start to finish without visiting pits. However, 1957 was an exception. At the 1957 German Grand Prix, Fangio decided to start the race with his Ferrari with softer tires and a half-full fuel tank, knowing that he would make a pit stop to change tires and refuel. His plan worked perfectly. In the middle of the race, at the Nürburgring, when it was necessary to make a pit stop, Fangio was already in the lead by 30 seconds to the nearest rival. However, the pit stop itself was a complete disaster. One mechanic dropped the wing nut under the car. It took about 30 seconds to find it and get it. After that, Juan Manuel Fangio showed one of his best races, winning back the gap of 48 seconds from his rivals, and drove to the victory in the Grand Prix. Due to problems with the nut, strategists considered pit stops too risky, so they continued to be used only for emergencies. In the 1960s, cars were designed to run the entire distance on one set of tires. At that time, there was no such thing as slicks. The teams used the same tires both in the wet race and on dry pavement. There were no pit stops in the 2-liter F1 era, confirmed 1964 champion John Surtees. Then we had tires with treads and a lot of rubber. They were good for any weather. Therefore, we didn't change them and the wheels were screwed tightly. That is why, if someone drove into the pits in the 60s, then his chances of winning instantly evaporated. Technology for changing tires was moved forward, but slowly. Slicks appeared in 1971. This meant that rain tires were now a separate set. However, the need to change tires was still in case of changing weather conditions. Then the pit stop could take more than a minute. That is how the impact driver unscrews the wheels in that era. Is it possible to keep within a few seconds with it? A rhetorical question. The 1970s were a cult time for Formula One, with radically interesting design and rapidly increasing speeds. But the teams were still quite small. In total, there were about 10 people who were involved in Formula One cars. Compared to the current times, when teams have more than 100 employees, such a small number of people seems incredible. Therefore, when it started to rain and it was necessary to change the set of tires, the teams didn't have many free hands to make a quick pit stop. The pit stop itself took about 40 seconds. It's for this reason that pit stops continue to be an undesirable thing. One of the major innovations of this era was the impact driver. The first pneumatic screwdrivers appeared in 1976. This device helped to remove tires in just a second, but if used carelessly, it was quite possible to break a hand. And here is a jack from 1976. This was used to raise the back of the car. However, the pit stops were still not properly organized. There was always something going on in the crowded pit lanes, especially with the mechanics, who were enthusiastically waving to their riders to get in the box. They weren't preparing for scheduled pit stops, explained Surtees, who owned the F1 team at the time, only for dangerous situations. For us, one pit stop took at least 2 to 3 minutes. Everything looked very hectic, but slowly. But in 1982, legendary designer Gordon Murray was inspired by Fangio. And although no one used refueling, it wasn't forbidden. I read the regulation to the holes and constantly looked for a loophole or a workaround, explains the chief engineer of Brabham. I thought about the mess. I always tried to reduce it. Then 0.45 kilograms of weight was approximately equal to a gain of 0.1 seconds per lap. The calculation didn't take long. And then I thought, wait a minute, a huge percentage of car's mass is fuel. I realized that if we cut that mass in half and go X seconds faster per lap, then a quick and efficient pit stop would win the race with less load. There were other benefits. A half-filled tank lowered the center of gravity. The car got faster with every lap. Also, we have tires. We knew they would wear out as the race progressed. So we began to change tires. And then the car went faster for a second or two in the first 5 to 10 laps. In fact, I simply solved a complex equation in which I included all these advantages and calculated. We will gain time if we make a pit stop faster than 26 seconds. Let's start winning races with scheduled pit stops. However, the task facing Murray and the mechanics team turned out to be even more difficult than it initially looked. The engineer had to completely redesign the impact drivers. The tires were thick and only warmed out after a few laps. But the main problem was in the turbo engine. When the car stood still for a few seconds, the bearing in the turbine overheated and melted. From the British Grand Prix, Piquet and Patrese Brabham cars will start with half-empty tanks, with a pit stop in the middle of the distance for changing tires and refueling. In order to implement this idea, they had to completely redesign the suspension and the bolt that secures the wheel to the car. As a result, they come up with a system in which the bolt for the new wheel remains in the impact driver. In order to change tires without problems, the team needed to quickly lift the car into the air, and they invented very light titanium jacks. Brabham's car is still the only Formula One car to have air jacks installed. On the pit stop, a compressed air installation was connected to the car, which directed air through the channels into the jacks, and the whole car accordingly rises. In the same way, in order for the car to lower, it was necessary to open the valves, and all this air would immediately come out of it, and the car was ready to continue the race. Brabham also changed the design inside the car, highlighting one air duct specifically for the overheating bearing. When the car was jacked up, the air duct opened and a fast cool stream rushed into the turbine. There was only one task left: how to pump 2 full tanks of conventional pickups into a Formula One car in a few seconds. And this is the most fun. We had 2 beer barrels, Murray explained. You know, 2 such solid aluminum barrels. Brabham came up with the idea of supplying fuel from both of them simultaneously at a pressure of 2 atmospheres and poured 140 liters of them in just 3 seconds. And it was really cool. The team added pressure to the refueling system, which literally pressed the fuel into the tank of the car. Most of the mechanics were in their firefighting suits with balaclavas, but some wore them only to cover their hairs. But due to the incident, the team had to wait until the Austrian Grand Prix to try out this strategy. Only there their cars were able to reach the middle of the racing distance. And finally, everything worked. Brabham's car led the entire first half of the race. Piquet drove to the pit stop for refueling and for new tires. The pit stop took about 25 seconds, but later Piquet had to retire due to technical breakdowns. Yes, it was then, at the 1982 Austrian Grand Prix, that the spectacle that we love so much today was born. But despite this, the rules of the game have changed, and the rest of the teams were modifying their cars to be able to refuel. At that time, pit stops weren't exactly regulated and teams could basically do whatever they wanted during pit stops. And when you are trying to pump flammable fuel under pressure, things can go wrong. It's for this reason that the use of refueling was banned by the end of the season. The prohibition of filling fuel at stops and boxes immediately greatly accelerated the pit stop process. By 1986, the average time to change all wheels was about 11 seconds. Then there were several tire suppliers: Michelin, Goodyear and Pirelli. And they all fought for the opportunity to be a monopoly in Formula One. Pit stops became a big part of the race weekend when the tire compound got soft. They allowed you to set faster lap times. But, of course, it's impossible to drive the entire distance of the race on such a set of tires. Therefore, strategy has become a key part of the game. Some teams squeeze the maximum out of the tires and hope for a quick pit stop, while some try to take care of the tires as best as possible and avoid pit stops. Perhaps the most striking demonstration of this was 1986 Grand Prix in Australia.
Mansell needed to finish the race in top 3 to win his first world title. Williams planned to bring both cars to finish line without changing tires. However, tire wear was stronger than expected, and with 90 laps to go, there was a colorful rear tire explosion in Mansell's car that damaged the car and ruined championship hopes. After this incident, it took Mansell 7 years to win the world title. Of course, by this time the teams had become more professional at the pits. They have become as important a part of the success as the correct car settings. When you realize that a team is spending a huge amount of money to make cars that are a tenth of a second faster, a good or bad pit stop can win or lose you more time.
Nature as a Formula 1 giant immediately saw room for improvement. They had enough stop, so they assigned another person to remove the tire. A mechanic with impact driver only twisted and untwisted the nut. Also, McLaren engineers came up with a special sign language that allows for instant non-verbal communication between staff. A man with a lollipop also appeared, following what was happening and giving signals to the driver. He no longer needed to guess about the moment of departure by removing the car from the jack. Because of these decisions, the reaction of riders accelerated, and in the 1993 German Grand Prix, McLaren showed everyone new pit stops. 4.81 seconds. The time of pit stops has been reduced to 5 seconds, so it has become unprofitable to try to refrain from stopping altogether.
One of the amazing facts of the time was that there was no speed limit in the pit lane. Cars could drive at high speed along the pit lane, try to drive into the pit through a crowd of mechanics, and drive back with a roar of the engine, wasting as little time as possible. Compared to current conditions, this level of safety seems fantastic, but surprisingly there were no serious incidents, and in general there were not too many of them.
It seemed that the 4-second mark was about to be crossed, but a new wave of technical revolution took place in Formula 1. Refueling was returned to race in 1994, and stop in the pits again stretched to 8 to 10 seconds. After the rule change, there was no longer any point to optimizing the pit stops even more, since the full filling of fuel still had to wait. Evolution stopped for almost 15 years.
The incident that changed everything happened at the Imola Grand Prix in 1994, when Minardi Michele Barretta's wheel bounced right before leaving the pit lane after a tire change and hit 4 Ferrari mechanics. After the race, a limit was placed on the number of people that could be present in the pit lane for each team, and the speed limit of 100 km per hour on the pit lane was introduced. In 1996, the refueling procedure was also changed. A lot has changed. Each team had to use a unified refueling system. The fuel pumping rate was much lower than that with which the fuel pumped earlier. This was until the Benetton team had an incident. While refueling, Jos Verstappen's car caught fire. In an attempt to reduce the speed of refueling, the team removed the filter from the refueling hose. In an attempt to make the fastest pit stop as it possible, the teams repeatedly released the car from the pit lane with fuel lines connected. Despite a large number of incidents, refueling in Formula 1 was allowed until 2010, until they were banned again.
From 1994 to 2009, pit stop speed was determined by the time it took to refuel the car. If there were no problems with jacks or impact drivers, tire changes were completed much earlier than the refueling. But everything changed in 2010. A rule was passed that forced teams to use at least 2 different tire compounds per race. This resulted in pit stops and even more probabilities, and strategies began to influence the outcome of the race even more. The guys from the Mercedes were the first to orient themselves again. They reinvented impact drivers that haven't been changed for about a decade. So, by the end of 2011, the best achievement have shifted to 3.4 seconds. The next big step forward was the appearance of a rotary jack. Now the mechanic who lifted the front of the car got the opportunity to get out of the way in advance, before lowering the car to the pavement. Together with the advent of automatic traffic lights that turn on the green signal immediately after the last bolt was clean, the inventions allowed the driver to leave earlier, and the pit stop time sank to 2.5 seconds.
Also in the same year, a new regulation was released on how pit stops should be carried out, in connection with which they were slowed down a bit, and due to the lack of practice with the new regulation, this led to a large number of errors. Pit stop mechanics are a very important part of the team. They must be trained no worse than the drivers. But also all members of the pit stop team have their own role within the team, that is, they are engineers in any department. But despite this, the most important part of their work is the analysis and practice of pit stops. They treat their work with pride and full commitment. You can see how happy they are when they make a good pit stop, or how upset they are when they make a bad pit stop. The irony is that a pit stop team cannot win a race, but they can still lose it.
However, not only the technical progress helped to cut time. Back in 2011, Red Bull realized the importance of working with staff and made a real breakthrough. They equipped a training building at the base, not only for drivers, but also for mechanics, hired several physiotherapists and consulted there, and introduced daily practice with wheels and impact drivers on the base, at least 10 to 15 repetitions. As a result, their time quickly improved to 2.5 to 2 seconds, and the rest of the teams copied the staff training model. It was Red Bull that was the first to break the 2-second mark. In 2014, mechanics serviced Mark Webber's car in 1.93 seconds. Williams was next in pursuit of records. In Grove, they developed a new jack that automatically lowers the car to the ground after tightening the last nuts, and also optimized the number and thread of turns on the bolts. The British also began to monitor the fitness of staff using individual biometric sensors and choose individual training plans. And in 2016, they conquered a record of 1.92 seconds. Naturally, all teams quickly copied their developments, but the pursuit of new achievements was briefly postponed due to the increase in tire weight by 2 kilograms. It took time to adapt.
Change all four wheels on the car in less than 2 seconds has been possible more than once. So at the Mexican Grand Prix, McLaren mechanics changed tires on Daniel Ricciardo cars in 1.98 seconds. But the best team in terms of pit stop efficiency is Red Bull Racing, which holds the record for the fastest pit stop during a race. At the 2019 Brazilian Grand Prix, mechanics serviced Max Verstappen cars in a incredible 1.82 seconds. No less impressive is the anti-record, almost 2 days. Yes, technically the longest pit stop lasted unthinkable 43 hours and 50 minutes. This is how long it took Mercedes mechanics to remove a wheel from Valtteri Bottas' car after cutting off part of a wheel nut with a wrench during a pit stop at 2021 Monaco Grand Prix. It was only possible to unscrew it and remove the wheel with the help of special tool at the team's base in Brackley.
This is how pit stops went from something avoided in periods to an essential part of Formula 1. Next time we will talk about how the modern pit stop happens, who is responsible for what, and why.